can often seem unlikely that historical mysteries will ever be solved, but every year new projects begin to explore some forgotten part of our collective history. Many of these reveal small secrets that could be the key to unlocking the truth in larger mysteries. Number 10. For hundreds of years, a collection of crowns, crosses, and goblets lay hidden in a field in Toledo, Spain. It wasn't until 1858 that the Guarazar treasure was discovered. But even when it was found, and after it was identified, mysteries remained about the find. One of the strangest, why they were buried there, was recently solved. The first find was made by the Morales family in the summer of 1858. They were traveling on the road to Guatemala when they made a rest stop at the spring of Guarazar. It was then that the daughter noticed something shining from beneath two stones behind the remains of a wall. The family dug up the treasure, washed it in a nearby well, and rushed away. The entire event was watched by a local gardener named Domingo de la Cruz. He returned the following night and dug around the same area. He found a second cache of treasure and kept it hidden. The Morales family sold the items to various jewelers, and much of the find was broken down and some of the gold was melted. But one jeweler named Jose Navarro recognized the significance of the find. These weren't just any jewels, but the treasure dated back to the Visigothic period, more than 1,000 years earlier. He brought back whatever he could find, pieced together the ancient crowns, and presented them to a museum in France. It was then that the Spanish government learned of the find and its significance. The crowns were votive crowns, donated by the Visigothic kings in the 7th century to the Roman Catholic Church. It was meant to symbolize the royalty being subservient to the church. The crowns were in the typical Byzantine fashion, complete with pendant letters that spelt out the names of the donating rulers. But the crowns were crafted locally. Some used jewels as far away as Sri Lanka. It showed that the area was rich and well connected with the rest of the medieval world. The find was the best collection of Visigothic treasure ever uncovered in Spain, even if some of the pieces were lost when the Morales sold their collection. It wasn't until World War II that the find was returned from Spain to France. Since then, there have been many studies on the items, but one thing those studies couldn't solve was why they were buried there and when. It's assumed that the local people buried the crowns in 711 when they heard that armies were advancing on the Visigothic capital of Toledo. 2 graves were dug up. The treasure was placed in the graves, covered with cloths and sand, before the bodies were placed on top and reburied. The story fit the evidence that was available, but what didn't make sense to historians was the fact that these were buried in a random field. Recent archaeological work at the find site has revealed this disused field wasn't always a field. Archaeologists found the remains of large structures, which were determined to be a large religious complex, similar to the one in France. It would have once been a very significant location, and even had a special building for pilgrims coming to the area. It also had healing waters, which came from the same well that the Morales family used to wash the gems. The treasure wasn't buried in a random field, but in a graveyard of one of the most significant buildings in the area. With that mystery solved, there's still plenty of intrigue surrounding the crowns. One of these is the location of one of the crowns dug up by Domingo de la Cruz. He gave his find to Queen Isabel II, but the crown was stolen from the royal palace in 1921. The police were unable to locate it, and the treasure remains lost. Number 9. Nestled in the hills of Granada is the Alhambra Palace, one of the best preserved palace complexes from the historical Islamic world. After the Napoleonic Wars, the centuries-old site became a popular tourist destination. But at the same time as its rise in popularity, a medieval frieze vanished without a trace. In 2021, it was revealed that one of the people who made the site so popular with tourists was responsible for the disappearance. The palace started life as a fort built in the 13th century. It was improved over the years and became its own small city, complete with an irrigation system. It wasn't just a defensive building, as shown by the works of art that adorned the walls and gardens. During the Reconquista, the palace itself wasn't attacked. The last sultan of the land surrendered before that could happen. With the palace left intact, it became the property of the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. The royal couple took up residence in the palace for a while, and it was here that Christopher Columbus presented his plans to sail across the Atlantic and find a westward route to Asia. For the next few centuries, the palace was a favorite of Spanish monarchs. The early Moorish artwork was joined by Renaissance-style art. But after the War of the Spanish Succession, the Alhambra Palace fell into a state of disrepair and was eventually forgotten. It wasn't until the end of the Napoleonic Wars that it became popular again. Travel writers from elsewhere in Europe came to visit the historical structures. In the 13th century, it was described as a pearl set in an emerald, describing the way the moonlight made the stone look white, surrounded by green trees of the hills. Writers in the 19th century were just as poetic, and it wasn't long before it became popular with tourists who were just realizing the attraction of Spain. Around this time, a 2-meter frieze vanished without a trace. The frieze was some of the oldest art in the palace. It was made from wood and dated back to between 1302 and 1309, during the reign of Sultan Muhammad III. The disappearance puzzled conservators and those working to preserve what was left of the palace. Of the theories that were put forward, one would turn out to be correct. Richard Ford was a travel writer from Britain. At the end of the Napoleonic Wars, he visited France, Germany, Austria, and Italy. While he was trained as a barrister, his real interest was in art. He could make some himself, but he was better at collecting and sponsoring the works of artists at home and abroad. When his wife fell ill, they moved to Spain in the hopes that the warmer climate would help her. During the summers of 1831 and 1833, they spent time in Granada, where Ford visited the Alhambra Palace. When he returned back to England, he brought with him countless works of art and books from Spain. He had also taken extensive notes on his travels and published a handbook for travelers in Spain. The book was credited with making Spain a tourist destination for Britons. There was a belief that Ford may have taken something home from the palace itself. While he had bought most of the art and books, it wasn't out of the question that he may have simply taken something. There was no proof of this until centuries later, when Ford's descendants came forward with the piece. 2 brothers were selling one of the family's properties when they came across the frieze. With the help of a Spanish art historian, they returned the frieze to the palace. It was still in relatively good condition and could now go on display in the place that it was created for. Number 8. The Mona Lisa is possibly the most famous piece of art in the world, and one that is surrounded by mystery. Every inch of the painting has been pored over by art historians to try to unlock the secrets that it might hide. While certain mysteries, like who the woman in the portrait is, have been answered, the location of the scene is one that's always baffled historians. In the spring of this year, a geologist and art historian came forward with the answer. Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa between 1503 and 1506. It's believed that the woman in the image is a noblewoman named Lisa del Giocondo, who lived in Florence. It wasn't a particularly important Da Vinci painting, and only became famous after it was stolen at the start of the 20th century. But since then, it's been seen by millions of people in France. While most people focus on the woman and the questions around her expression, for art historians, it's the background that gets the most attention. The background of the Mona Lisa is a scenic landscape, complete with rivers, a lake, and mountains in the distance. The only sign of human life is a bridge with 4 visible arches on the right side of the painting. It's this bridge that has captivated art historians trying to pinpoint the location of the scene. While some believe that the entire scene was a figment of Da Vinci's imagination, others believe he was painting a real place. For most of those trying to pinpoint a location, the bridge is believed to be the clue. For Anne Piso-Russo, the bridge was a red herring. Piso-Russo started her career as a geologist, but became fascinated by Italian Renaissance art. She's been able to combine her 2 specialties and look at the natural landscape depicted in the backgrounds of various works of art. It helped to uncover the truth about other Da Vinci paintings. When Piso-Russo solved the mystery of the background of the Mona Lisa, she thought the solution was so obvious that she didn't realize it was a mystery. After traveling to the quiet town of Lecco on the shores of Lake Como in northern Italy, she recognized the features of the landscape from the painting. Piso-Russo claims the bridge is simple enough that it could be seen in many bridges in northern Italy, which explains why so many different locations have been proposed based only on the bridge. But the geology of the landscape is much more specific and harder to see just anywhere. Using mapping techniques around Lecco, Pizarro was able to match various features in the painting to the real world. According to Pizarro, Da Vinci took great care to paint the natural world as realistically as possible. When she saw suggestions that a copy of a Da Vinci might have actually been painted by the master artist himself, she was able to confirm otherwise based on the plants in the painting. The plants had no real-world counterpart, so it could not have been an authentic Da Vinci. Even if the plants were painted accurately, it would make more sense for an entire lakeshore landscape to be something real, rather than Da Vinci's imagination. So the details of the colors of the rocks in the landscape were just as important in determining that this was a Lecco scene, as the general shape of the mountains and the lake shore. While many art historians have agreed with Pizarro's conclusions, there are some who still believe other theories that focus on details like the bridge, and this may be a mystery with an answer that will never be agreed upon. Number 7. In 1812, Napoleon's Grand Army marched on Russia. Of the 600,000 troops that left, around half never made it back alive. One of those who did not survive the invasion was General Charles Gan. For 200 years, the location of his remains was lost. He was finally returned home in 2019. Gan was one of Napoleon's favorite generals. He was born into a noble family, but studied at the same military school as the famous emperor. He fought in the French Revolutionary Wars, rising through the ranks before he was given the command of his battalion. Gan's military career featured many battles, often within a short space of time. Napoleon's military tactics often relied on moving quickly to always stay ahead of the enemy, which can be seen in Gan's record. By 1812, he'd won the favor of the emperor, and his name would later be inscribed on the Arc de Triomphe. He'd been wounded in battle many times, but fought on. The majority of the soldiers who didn't survive the invasion of Russia suffered from disease or a lack of food, but Gan was one of the many who were lost in battle. The Battle of Smolensk was the first major battle in the invasion, taking place in early August. Today, the town sits near the border between Russia and Belarus. At the time, there were 15,000 people living in the town, but most didn't survive the attack. Despite the massive casualties for the Russians, the French forces didn't go without losses. Gan was struck in the leg by a cannonball. He was rushed to doctors, but there was nothing they could do to save the leg. Within days of the incident, he passed away due to an infection. Gan's heart was removed and taken back to France, but taking the rest of his body back would have been impossible in the circumstances. Instead, he was buried near the scene, and the invasion of Russia continued. One of Gan's subordinates, Marshal Davout, wrote about his funeral in his memoirs. He described a mausoleum made from 4 cannon barrels pointed upwards, but the exact location was lost in the years after the war and became a mystery. In 2019, interest in the mystery rose again, and a team of researchers began to try to find the lost general. Davout's memoirs were analyzed and a possible gravesite was located, but there was no trace of the missing general. But Davout wasn't the only person to have witnessed the burial. The combined French and Russian team then turned to the writings of other witnesses. Another gave details that led to a park in central Smolensk. Buried beneath an old dance floor, they found a wooden casket. Inside the casket was the remains of a man with a detached leg. The wounds on the skeleton seemed to match those that Gan would have suffered, but the researchers couldn't be certain that this was the missing general without DNA evidence. Samples taken from the remains were compared to living family members and DNA from his brother. The samples were a match, and the remains were determined to have belonged to Gan. In 2021, they were returned to France, where they were received by a guard of honor wearing a Napoleonic uniform. He was buried at the Hôtel des Invalides in Paris. Number 6. Calcotzingo is an important archaeological site in Mexico. Studies at the site have provided valuable insight into the world of the Olmec civilization, the culture seen as the parent to the more famous Mesoamerican cultures that came later. But while the site was still being explored by early archaeologists, an important sculpture was stolen. The mystery of the missing Olmec cave mask puzzled historians and investigators before the truth was uncovered more than 60 years later. Calcutsingo thrived between 800 and 300 BC, but people had been there for hundreds of years before then. Grand temples were built, and the landscape was terraformed to support the population. While some of the temples were man-made, the natural landscape was also seen as sacred. 2 large hills are situated nearby, and reliefs and artwork were carved onto the rocks' faces. The art depicts scenes from the culture's creation mythology, including one concerning a king at an entrance to a cave. Other pieces of artwork were freestanding sculptures. One of these, known as Monument 9, or the Portal to the Underworld, caught the attention of at least one collector. The large sculpture is believed to depict a cave, possibly the one from the reliefs. It has 2 eyes above a large square hole that forms not only the entrance to the cave, but the mouth of a jaguar. It was first discovered in the late 1950s, when interest in pre-Columbian history of Mexico was really beginning. Calcutsingo wasn't fully understood, and nobody realized the significance of Monument 9. At some point in the 1960s, it disappeared. Archaeologist David C. Grove was the first person to write about Monument 9 in an article about Olmec rock carvings. Around the same time, the monument, or Olmec cave mask, appeared at an art institute in New York. It had been broken into pieces to make it easier for smugglers to transport it away from the historical site, but all the pieces had remained together. Over the next few years, it appeared at various museums before being sold to a private collector and disappearing from sight. More studies were conducted at Calcutsingo in the absence of the portal. Now, archaeologists knew of its significance, but it seemed unlikely that this ancient monument would ever be rediscovered. That didn't stop scholars from working on uncovering more information about the ancient culture and what role the mask played. It's believed that the portal would have symbolized an actual doorway to the spirit world for the Olmec people. As more information was learned, archaeologists started to work with authorities in Mexico and the US to try to uncover the new location of the monument. The investigation began properly in 2005, but by then it had been decades since the monument was displayed in public. It seemed unlikely it would ever be found. Local archaeologists were dedicated to finding the mask, though, and in 2008, the location was finally confirmed. It had been sold to a private collector in Colorado. Even with the location confirmed, getting the historical piece back to its proper location wasn't easy. It wasn't until 2023 that it was announced that the portal would be returning to Mexico. The cave mask had some significant damage, though. It had been broken into several pieces for transportation, and the metal support and cement reinforcements had been added to the sculpture. But for the most part, the original monument remained. It was transported back to Mexico in the summer of 2023 and put on display at the Palacio de Cortes. Number 5. The baobab tree has earned the nickname the Tree of Life and the Upside Down Tree, and has one of the most recognizable appearances of any tree in the world. But the story of this strange tree begins in mystery, which scientists have only recently solved. There are 8 distinct species of baobab found in Madagascar, mainland Africa, and northwestern Australia. The trees. These trees are adapted to life in an arid environment and have helped many species of animals, as well as humans, to survive difficult conditions. For hundreds of years, humans have used various parts of the tree for everything from clothing to medicinal purposes. Its most obvious benefit is the large trunks which store water, which can be accessed during the dry season. Its fruit is also known as a superfood and is very nutrient-dense. The trees have culture and spiritual significance to some societies where they grow, which makes the fact that many of the species are endangered or critically endangered even more distressing. Scientists hope that figuring out the origin of the baobab tree could help to solve the mystery of why so many are disappearing. Scientists analyzed the DNA from the various species to try to get to the bottom of their origin story. The first baobab tree evolved 21 million years ago. By that point, the shape of the continents looked roughly how they do today, although changes in the sea levels meant that certain areas that are now underwater were then dry land. In particular, the island of Madagascar was slightly larger. and it was on this island that the first baobab trees evolved. It's believed that this extra area allowed the plant to thrive. Between 20.6 and 12.6 million years ago, new species of tree evolved. This happened as different trees adapted to different parts of the island. Some species diverged from one another, then converged again, creating new species. And at some point, at least 2 species left the island. How exactly the trees came to Africa and Australia remains a mystery. Scientists have confirmed the African and Australian species evolved from the same plants that emerged in Madagascar. This wasn't simply the case of the tree evolving and then the continents separating from one another. It's believed that seeds from the trees floated across the ocean on vegetation rafts, traveling along the currents that circle the Indian Ocean. Once they landed in Africa, they were able to spread across the continent in Southwest Asia. The spread wasn't as far in Australia, with the tree limited to the Northern Territory and Western Australia. The African and Australian baobabs became their own species, but only one species developed on each continent. Scientists found that in Madagascar, there was limited genetic diversity in some of the species endemic to the island. That would make them more susceptible to disease if one were to hit the population. Many are already endangered. It's hoped that understanding how the species originated and developed can help to save the trees. Many individuals have already been lost, and it's believed dehydration, as well as deforestation, might be responsible for their losses. Number 4. Sat on an isolated hill near the city of Granada in Spain is the remains of a medieval settlement that was once a densely populated town. El Castillejo was abandoned sometime in the 14th century, after being occupied for hundreds of years, but its downfall always remained a mystery. It wasn't until archaeologists and paleoseismologists started to take a deeper look at the site that the reason was found. Ancient volcanic eruptions are relatively simple to spot in the archaeological record, but earthquakes are much harder to determine. The historical record of earthquakes is mostly based on reports from the time period. This means that areas with little written records often hide seismological secrets, and their history remains blank. A team of researchers from British and Spanish universities decided to use new techniques to try to fill in some of the blank space. El Castillejo was first occupied in the early 11th century. The settlement was built on top of a hill, protecting it from any possible invaders. Structures were built on both the north and south face of the hill, with a protective wall surrounding it. Over the next few centuries, El Castillejo flourished, with generations of families calling this place home. But that abruptly stopped sometime in the mid-13th century. Years later, people returned to El Castillejo, but not as many as before. The town was no longer a grand settlement, but a small occupation built on the rubble of the abandoned city. The cause for this abandonment remained a mystery. There was no sign that an attack had taken place, or that water or food shortages caused the problem. With the new study, scientists and historians were able to determine that an earthquake was to blame. The team looked at evidence both in the town itself and the surrounding area. They were able to determine clear seismic activity in the geological record. Something had shaken the town at some point between 1224 and 1266 CE. Looking at the buildings themselves, the damage was clear. The homes of El Castillejo were built with a rammed earth construction technique. This doesn't use any mortar between the bricks of compressed dirt. Unfortunately, this building style meant that when an earthquake hit, the blocks were able to shift horizontally, which would quickly lead to entire buildings coming down. The evidence for this destruction was apparent even to the first archaeologists to look at the site, but they believed this was the result of the abandonment, with structures no longer being maintained and left for nature to destroy. Now it was clear that this was the cause of the abandonment in the first place. At the same layer as the broken tiles and tumbled bricks, archaeologists found burned plant matter and scorch marks. While the buildings were collapsing, a fire was raging through the settlement. This was seen as evidence that the place had been occupied at the time of the quake. The shaking would have damaged hearths and knocked over torches and braziers, which caused the fire to spread. The only thing that archaeologists didn't find was human remains. In the case of an emergency, it would have been extremely difficult for people to escape. Not only were the buildings closely packed together, but the steep slopes of the hill would have been difficult to run down. This was seen as evidence that either a rescue operation had taken place, or foreshocks had warned the villagers of what was going to happen. Why the town was never rebuilt still remains unexplained. Some people did eventually return to the town, using rubble to build new houses, but the population never fully recovered. Number 3. From late antiquity to the medieval period, illuminated manuscripts were some of the most intricate pieces of art being produced. Miniature pictures would adorn the pages of religious and secular texts, alongside the handwritten records. Inventions like the printing press and synthetic dyes meant many of the techniques used to create these artworks were lost to time. Over the years, the pigments that artists used were gradually uncovered, but the source of the mysterious Folium dye remained a mystery. Folium was first used in the 13th century and became popular as a long-lasting blue pigment. Depending on how it was prepared, it could change color from purple to red, but it was blue that was most often used. There were 3 blue pigments that were primarily used in the time period. As well as folium, there was indigo and anthocyanins, which are found in blue flowers and fruits. Analysis of these pigments found that the folium was completely different to either of these 2 dyes, but what it was remained a mystery. Even before illuminated manuscripts fell from favor, folium went out of use. Artists preferred more vivid colors. Even though the folium dye was long-lasting, it couldn't create the exact hue they preferred. By the end of the 17th century, it was no longer used, making it even harder to track down how the dye was created. The mystery was finally solved by a team combining natural scientists and knowledge of medieval texts. Some pieces of the puzzle had been known for a while. For example, scientists have long known which plant exactly produced this strange pigment. Texts described a small plant native to southern Portugal. The plant was never named, but the descriptions were so detailed that scientists were able to determine it was a dyer's croton. But even with the knowledge of the specific plant, extracting the dye was still an unsolved problem. Researchers turned to texts from the time period in hopes that some could reveal a solution to the mystery. One, a book titled The Book on How to Make the Color Paints for Illuminating Books, provided an exhaustive answer. The problem was that this was difficult to read, as it was written phonetically in Portuguese using Hebrew characters. The team consulted other texts, but deciphering this book would finally provide the answers they were looking for. Following the exact instructions, they collected the fruits of the plant in the summer months. Between July and September is specified by the text. The dye came from the shell of the fruit. It was important not to crush the fruit's seed, as this would release a chemical that couldn't be extracted from the rest of the dye. Gently squeezing the fruits and then placing them on a fabric released the vibrant blue color that would be used by medieval scribes to help bring the captured scenes to life. Solving this mystery was significant to those wanting to preserve the manuscripts for future generations. Now that this exact chemical used to create the color has been identified, scientists can determine how it will react to certain environments and how the ancient art can better be protected going forwards. Number 2. Hatshepsut is one of the most important figures in ancient Egyptian history, but one that was shrouded in mystery for a long time. After she passed away, her successors tried to remove her name from history, and confusion surrounding the fact she used male titles only further confused archaeologists. But while much of Hatshepsut's story has been restored, it wasn't until recently that her mummy was identified. Hatshepsut was the ruler of the 18th dynasty of Egypt. She was the daughter of Thutmose I, the third ruler of the dynasty, and came to power when the dynasty was still strong. She first served as a consort to her brother husband Thutmose II. When her husband passed away, his planned successor was only 2 years old. Hatshepsut ruled as a co-monarch with her stepson and took Egypt's strength to new heights. She oversaw major construction projects and re-established trade networks, particularly to the mysterious land of Punt. She wasn't just a regent, but took steps to show that she could perform the religious duties of the pharaoh. Inscriptions about her work reinforced that she was the ruler of Egypt. It's believed Hatshepsut passed away in the 22nd year of her reign, in 1458 BC. Her successors were quick to try to remove her from the historical record, scratching her name off of inscriptions and taking credit for her work. But what happened to her mummy was more peculiar. She was originally buried in a tomb known as KV-20 in the Valley of the Kings. During her reign, she extended the tomb of her father so she could be laid to rest there. But when KV-20 was discovered, there was no sign of either mummy. During the 21st dynasty, the rulers moved many of the mummies of the earlier dynasties to try to protect them from grave robbing. Many of those remains ended up in a cache discovered in 1881. Hatshepsut's remains weren't there. It was later discovered that Hatshepsut's father's remains were removed during the reign of his grandson and placed in a new grand tomb. It was believed that Hatshepsut's mummy was removed around the same time, but to where is more of a mystery. In 1903, famous Egyptologist Howard Carter discovered the tomb at KV-60. It looked as if it had been ransacked and wasn't too interesting to them. There were still 2 mummies inside, though. One was a sarcophagus labeled with a name. This was Hatshepsut's wet nurse. The other mummy didn't have any identification. The mummy was removed to the Cairo Museum, but the second mummy was forgotten. In 2007, attention returned to this mysterious second mummy. She had her right arm crossed across her chest, something that usually symbolized a royal mummy. The Egyptian Mummy Project began to scan all unidentified mummies in this pose, in the hopes that they could solve the mystery of their identities. At the same time, a box with Hatshepsut's name on it was also analyzed. This contained some of the remains taken from Hatshepsut during the mummification process. It also contained a tooth. The unidentified mummy had a missing tooth, which experts believed perfectly matched the one in the box. The DNA was extracted from the KV-60 mummy and compared to DNA from known members of Hatshepsut's family. According to experts, there was a match. Some have cast doubts on this discovery, especially as the tooth itself was never analyzed, as extracting DNA from that tooth would destroy it. But for now, it seems the mystery of Hatshepsut's mummy has been solved. Number 1. During the Second World War, hundreds of submarines were sunk on both sides, including 73 operated by the UK's Royal Navy. Of those, most were found in the years after they sank, even though they couldn't be recovered. But some managed to elude searchers for decades. One of these was HMS Trooper, which was on a top-secret mission when it sank somewhere between Greece and Turkey in October of 1943. Almost exactly 81 years after the sinking, the wreck of the Trooper was located in October of 2024. The submarine was last seen on October 1st, 1943. The Trooper only had a relatively short career, going into service in the summer of 1942. She took part in an operation in the East Mediterranean, then began a new mission, patrolling the waters around Greece. The boat left Beirut on the 26th of September and took 67 men across the sea to Kalamos, a Greek island occupied by the Axis powers. It arrived late on the night of September 30th, and early the following morning, 3 men left the vessel. They were 2 British Special Operations officers and a Greek intelligence officer, taking part in an operation nicknamed Eruption. The trio were to travel to Athens to cause disruption. After 3 agents left the vessel, it disappeared back below the waters. Operation Eruption went ahead, but the operatives would never see anybody aboard the Trooper again. HMS Trooper was supposed to return to Beirut on October 17th. When it failed to return, it was presumed lost in action. The submarine had been sent to patrol the waters around Greece, many of which were filled with German mines. At the time, there was no hope of recovering the ship, and it wasn't until after the end of the war that searches took place. The captain of a British ship that had been in Alinda Bay 3 days before Trooper was due at port reported spotting the sub in that area. He claimed to have made contact with it and even recognized the voice of the lieutenant when they exchanged greetings. Later searches would take place in that area, assuming that Trooper must have sunk shortly after this sighting. German forces had also spotted a submarine they believed to have been HMS Trooper in that area. They claimed to have sunk the boat on October 15th, but they couldn't be sure the boat in question was damaged. They also didn't know if it was the Trooper. On both occasions, the identification was wrong. It was actually another submarine, HMS Torbay, that had been spotted and attacked. The Torbay survived the attack, and the search for the Trooper had to look elsewhere. In 2024, a Greek underwater recovery team named Planet Blue took up the search. They looked at the most recent placement of the mines when the trooper went missing, and found that a minefield had been laid in the same area that the trooper had been patrolling. The Icarian Sea is a very dangerous place with strong winds, waves, and undercurrents. But searches of the area using sonar and submersible vehicles allowed the team to find what they were looking for. The trooper was lying in 3 parts, 830 feet below the surface of the water. Examining the wreck confirmed that it had hit a mine. It also revealed that the submarine had been on the surface when it was hit, as hatches were found open. The wreck wasn't disturbed in any way, and the area is now considered a war grave. It's hoped that solving the mystery can bring closure to the families of those who lost their lives on the submarine. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.